Welcome to Film and Page. I'm Dominic, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about the illustrated Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley and illustrated by comic book artist Bernie Wrightson. So my background with the story of Frankenstein is the first time I picked up the book was at a garage sale, probably back in the mid-2000s, and this is the version that I picked up right here. And I bought it, believe it or not, for 10 cents, so I basically got it for free. And I read it, well, it actually sat on my shelf for quite a few years before I actually got around to reading it. But I read it probably about 7 or 8 years ago and actually really liked the story. And then just recently reread it again for this video because I recently got the illustrated version of this book. So the version I'm going to be focusing on in this video is the Bernie Wrightson illustrated version. And I recently picked this one up online. And this one came out, they did a new version recently, and there's a few different versions of this illustrated one. But so I don't know how I think some of them differ in size and some of the types of illustrations that are in the book. So this is the one that I have and the one that I could find online, but there are other ones out there. So right off the bat, as you can see, the cover for this book looks fantastic with this illustration on it. There's a look at the spine. So taking a closer look at the cover, I really like the artwork in this book. It is absolutely fantastic. Mary Shelley, illustrations by Bernie Wrightson. Introduction by Stephen King. Closer look at the spine. And taking a look at the back. Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Bernie Wrightson. I'll take a look at some of the illustrations on the inside because Bernie Wrightson's artwork is just perfect for this story. And it has some actually really mind-blowing illustrations in it. Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? Paradise Lost. There's table of contents. And an introduction by Stephen King. Here's the first illustration of the book, where the story begins. Now, Bernie Wrightson took a lot of inspiration from the old woodcuts to do a lot of the illustrations for this. I find with these illustrations, they were just something about them, they were made to be in black and white. I really love all the heavy shadows that he puts into these illustrations. It really suits the story. Bernie Wrightson was truly a one of a kind. There's not too many comic artists today that can hold a candle to his work. The level of detail in these drawings, it's just like crazy. And the way Frankenstein is illustrated in this, or the monster I should say, illustrated in this, it's much closer to the description given in the book. Usually when I do these kind of reviews, like I don't go and show every illustration through the book, but every one in this book is so fantastic that I thought I'd go through and just show every single one of them. This is another one of my favorites. I just love the heavy shadows. And his style is like just perfect for horror. And the thing about this one, they did an illustrated Dracula with Jay Lee, and I reviewed that one last year. This one has a lot more illustrations in it. And there's a few double page ones in this. I love the way the monster looks in these illustrations. And who is really the monster? Is it the monster or Victor Frankenstein himself? I'm going to talk about that later in the video. And in this version of Frankenstein, the monster is a lot more agile than in the Universal film. Yeah, like the detail is just incredible. Look at all the books stacked up. Just amazing. It's another fantastic one. It's another favorite of mine. Victor Frankenstein creating a potential bride for the monster. Now, this here illustration is by far the most famous one. This one's on the cover. And I would always see this one in places like Wizard Magazine and in comic book ads and comic book magazines and stuff like that. And it is just crazy detail in this one. Just blows the mind. Again, I just love all the heavy shadows. This one here is one of my favorites in the book, this illustration. And the last illustration in the book, another one of my favorites. Just crazy detail. So I'll talk a bit about my background with the character. So I became aware of Frankenstein probably like most people nowadays is through the old black and white Universal films. They would always rerun them a lot on cable TV when I was growing up, and CBC television would show them a lot. So I remember seeing Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, and one that really stood out in my mind, Frankenstein versus the Wolfman. So that's how I became aware of the character. And the other thing is the character in my mind, like Dracula, and like I said in that video, it's always been kind of linked in my mind with Halloween, because you'd always see a lot of Frankenstein imagery out in stores and stuff, and masks and costumes. It's one of the go-tos. The B for Halloween is the Frankenstein monster and things like that. And of course, there's the famous misconception that the monster's name is Frankenstein. I even had that misconception. I think that was kind of created from the title of the films, because the film would feature the creature on the cover, and then it would be called Frankenstein, and especially with the sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein, where they're making a bride for the monster, but not for Frankenstein, the scientist himself. So there's that famous misconception. And just the character, like Dracula, has just totally permeated pop culture. And so it was interesting to read the original source material of the book after seeing all the movies. I'd have even seen the new one with Robert De Niro, or the newest version of it, of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is a lot more closer to the novel than the Universal Studios one. But still, I was never really a big fan of that movie either. But then going and reading the book, they changed it so much from the book to the films. that it's pretty mind-boggling, the difference. But it's a really great story. And after reading it and reading Dracula, I think I like the story of Frankenstein a bit more than Dracula. Now, the thing about Frankenstein and the Frankenstein's monster and the story and the movies and all that stuff that has always drawn me to it is I've always been kind of into things that are dark, like horror movies, like gothic horror, and just that whole gothic look. And that's just something the Universal films really oozed really well, is that German expressionism and that dark gothic look and all that kind of thing. That's something that's always drawn me to it. And even the book, the images the book evokes in your mind as you're reading it, has the same effect. And then with this illustrated version, it really has that effect. It does a great job of capturing that gothic Victorian look, I think, the illustrations of this book. So now a little bit of background information about the author. So Mary Shelley was born August 30th, 1797, and she was married to Percy Shelley. And she passed away on February 1st of 1851 at the age of 53. And she was an English novelist who wrote the Gothic novel Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus. She wrote some other books, but that's probably the one she's most famous for. And it is considered one of the first examples of science fiction. And she also edited and promoted the works of her husband, the romantic poet and philosopher, Percy Shelley. And her father was the political philosopher William Godwin, and her mother was the philosopher and feminist activist Mary Wollstonecraft. That's a mouthful, that last name. So that's a little bit about Mary Shelley. Now I'll talk a little bit about the comic artist Bernie Wrightson. Bernard Albert Wrightson was born October 27th, 1948, and died March 18th, 2017. Sometimes credited as Bernie Wrightson, was an American artist known for co-creating Swamp Thing and his adaptation of the novel Frankenstein, the illustrated work. So he's really famous for his horror stuff, and I became aware of him through the Swamp Thing comics. I have some trade paperbacks of the Swamp Thing that he illustrated, he and drew and stuff like that, and his artwork on those books is just fantastic. He is so perfect for horror, and that's why it works so well. Much like the pairing of Jay Lee with Dracula, his style really suited that story. I think the same thing with this one here, Bernie Wrightson's style really suits the story of Frankenstein. So a little bit about publication history. So this was originally published in 1983 by Marvel Comics. And so it's been reprinted by different companies over the years. And so depending on which version you have, the book varies in size and actually varies in some of the illustrations, because there were some editions that actually put in some illustrations that weren't originally published in the original version that was done by Marvel Comics. So I'm not really sure if my edition has all the illustrations or has some missing or not, but I think mine does, because there's quite a few illustrations in there, as you can see from earlier in the video. So now I'm going to talk about the story of Frankenstein, because as I said earlier in the video, I actually read this book many years ago and then reread it again for this video. So I'll give a quick rundown of the plot if you have never read Frankenstein. So I'm going to talk in detail about the book. So this is going to be I'm going to start off with my spoiler-free review. Frankenstein is a fantastic, classic Gothic horror story. You should go read it now. So there's my spoiler-free review. So now I'm going to get into details. So a quick rundown of the plot. So the story takes place, it begins in the Arctic, and there's a ship that is trying to explore the Arctic. It's a sailing ship, and they get stuck in some ice. And while they're there, they catch a glimpse of this strange, large, tall creature riding a sled, and it kind of disappears off into the distance. And then they come across another individual out on the ice, and this person is almost on the brink of death and suffering from exposure. And this is Dr. Victor Frankenstein. So the beginning of the book is actually the captain of this ship writing letters back to his sister in London, telling her of this experience of him meeting Victor Frankenstein. So they bring Victor Frankenstein aboard, and him and the captain start to bond. And because the captain is really desperate for a friend, as he talks about in his letters to his older sister. So he kind of sees Victor Frankenstein as a potential friend. So as they start to become friends, Victor Frankenstein starts to relate to him the story or the chain of events that led up to this point. And so then the story goes back in time, as Victor Frankenstein is talking about how he became involved with science and how he was like incredibly ambitious, and he wants to really push the frontiers of science and the secrets of life and the secrets that could unlock immortality and all those things. So he ends up creating a sentient creature. He creates it, and he's totally blindly ambitious. And when he does this, he is horrified by his own creation and just outright immediately ditches it upon it just waking up into the world. And so what happens when he does this? Well, then it comes back on him really bad, and it has really horrible ramifications for him. So now, the thing about this story when I was reading it, I have to say, and this is something that I didn't really think about much when I read it the first time, but I thought about it a lot more reading it this time around. Victor Frankenstein is not a sympathetic character at all, and he's not really a likable one either. And because everything that happens to him in this book is because he is blindly ambitious, and he doesn't care about the ramifications of what his ambition could bring on others. He's going to go and do this experiment, and he doesn't give any thought into, well, okay, when I create this thing, what's going to happen? He doesn't care about that at all. He just goes ahead with it and creates it. And then second of all, he completely ditches it after that. He's horrified by his own creation, so he's completely, absolutely irresponsible. And then the third thing is he never, ever, barely shows any empathy towards this creature that he created. And the only reason he does so is because of how the creature looks. So he's shallow, and he doesn't have any sympathy. So there's that. And it makes it really hard to sympathize with him as a character because of this. And this lack of sympathy and all this kind of thing is the reason all this horrible stuff happens to him. So the story kind of goes in two directions. It tells the events from Victor Frankenstein's point of view, of him creating the monster, him getting horrified, ditching the monster, and then trying to go on with his normal life until he actually meets up with his own creation several years down the road. And at this point, the creature's evolved quite a bit and can speak and is quite intelligent and all this thing. And so then the creature tells his side of the story of what happened to him when he awoke into the world and when his creator abandoned him and all the things that he had to go through. So the monster in the story is actually a very sympathetic character. I really felt bad for the creature because he didn't ask to be created, and he does horrible things in it, but it's because he's smart, but he doesn't have a lot of life experience because he hasn't been alive very long in the story, only a few years. So he does do horrible things, but he's driven to that point because no one in the world shows him any sympathy. Everyone just outright rejects him. There's the people at the cabin. That was probably the saddest part of the book, is he hides in a hovel next to this cabin where there is this family living there. And this is where he learns to speak and he learns to read and all that by listening to this family. And then he kind of acts as a guardian angel for this family. He helps them, brings them firewood, does all this thing, even though they never see him. And then he kind of thinks of himself as part of the family. And he decides that he's going to reveal himself to the family, and then they will kind of take him in and accept him. So the father is blind. So he first reveals himself to him and tries to explain himself. But he doesn't pull it off very good. It wasn't very well thought out. And then the children come home, see this horrible creature next to their grandfather, and they freak out and they drive him out the house. And then they up and ditch that cottage and cabin. They never go back there. So he's just completely heartbroken by this. And so he burns the cabin down. And then there's just more things that happen to him like that. And so he tries relaying all this to Victor Frankenstein. He says, you have to have some responsibility in this. You created me. And so he wants Frankenstein to create a female version of him, another creature like him, but a female, so he could have a partner or a mate. So initially, he convinces Frankenstein to do it. So he is going to do it. And but then he realizes, well, this creature I created, I don't know how long this creature could live. It could be immortal. And then he sees like how powerful the creature is, because it's incredibly strong and it's fast. The monster in this is very fast, agile, and intelligent. And so the monster swears to him, if you create this mate for me, we'll just disappear into some part of the world, remote part of the world, and you'll never have to deal with us again. So he thinks, well, this is how I can get rid of him. Is I can create this mate for him, and they can both get out of my hair. Then he starts to realize, well, there's no reason the other creature I create, if I create a second creature, there's no reason that creature is going to go along with this bargain I made, because it's going to have its own will. It's its own thing. So then he decides not to do it. So then the monster takes revenge on him. And so the first revenge it does, well, before that, actually, it kills some frames. It kills his younger brother. Then it frames one of their close friends, this woman, frames her for the murder. Then she gets hung. Then it kills another one of Victor Frankenstein's best friends. And then it just goes on and on and on. And so the story progresses like that, where they both get so consumed by their own hatred for the other that it gets to the point in the story, the ending of the story, again, it ends off with them in the sailing ship. And so finally, Victor Frankenstein gets so weak that he dies. And then the captain of the ship is confronted by the monster. And the monster kind of talks about, even though he had this raging hatred, he still wanted to have some kind of acceptance from his creator. And so anyway, the creature just decides, well, I have nothing left. That's all I wanted to do was destroy this guy that put me through this situation. And so then he leaves and ends up killing himself. Or he says he's going to anyway, the creature. And so the captain is left totally dumbfounded by all this. So it's a very tragic story, because it's this cycle of revenge they want to get on each other that really leads to both of them being destroyed at the end of the book. And there are several points in the book where Frankenstein could have stopped all this by happening, by just showing some sympathy for the creature he created and showing some responsibility for it. So if Victor Frankenstein had to do one of those things or two of those things, then his life wouldn't have been destroyed and all the family members around him wouldn't have suffered like they did. So how does this compare to Dracula? So I think this is a better story than Dracula, in my opinion, after reading both of them. Now, I really like them both. Don't get me wrong, but I think Frankenstein edges out Dracula. For one reason, it's more of a character piece than, in my opinion anyway, than Dracula is. Because Dracula, you have the main cast of characters, but the author doesn't really dig into the characters the way Mary Shelley does with these two characters. You really get to know Victor Frankenstein very, very well, and how he thinks and what makes him tick. And so he's a very much more realized character than any of the characters in Dracula. Same thing with the monster. The monster is very well fleshed out character, so you really get inside their heads. Where comparing the Frankenstein's monster to Dracula, Dracula is barely in Dracula. It's more or less all the other characters reacting to things Dracula is doing off camera. And he's a little in it at the beginning, and then a few places in the middle of the book, and then briefly at the end. But Dracula's just this creature. He's not really, he's just like this force of nature the characters in the book have to deal with. So you don't know what his motivations are, and he's not sympathetic. He's just this monster, this killing machine that the main cast of characters have to deal with. Where Frankenstein's monster really isn't a monster. He's just this creature that looks horrible, but he had a decent soul. He had a better soul than the guy who made him, in my opinion. And I think Victor Frankenstein is more of a monster than the monster he created in this book, in my opinion. And not only that, the book of Frankenstein, it's a fairly short book. It's not even 300 pages, so it's a bit more digestible, I think, than Bram Stoker's Dracula. But if you want a great read for Halloween, this is a perfect book to pick up. No matter what edition you pick up, it's a great read for the month of October or in the fall or any time of the year for that matter. And if you can get this version of Frankenstein, all the better, because the illustrations in it are fantastic. Just a great book, and it's amazing to think that this story is over 200 years old, and you can go in almost any bookstore and pick it up anytime. So that's everything I got to say in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and I will see you at the next one. I'd like to say thank you to all of my subscribers. I appreciate you all in helping this channel grow. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when new videos are uploaded.